Welcome to another Parallel Project Training podcast. This podcast is based on the APM PMQ syllabus launch in September 2024. My name is Carmen Campos, and I'm here today with Ruth Phillips to talk about transition management. Hello, Ruth.
Hi, I'm really looking forward to talking to you about transition management.
Great. Thank you for joining me today. So during this podcast, we are going to cover the learning outcomes linked to transition management for this PMQ qualification. So Ruth, I think if we could start first with understanding the terminology for those who are not familiar with the term transition. What is the transition phase in projects and what do we mean by transition management?
Yeah, I think there's some good questions there. So transition is the point towards the end of the project where we've produced the outputs of the project, and we're going through this process of integrating these outputs into business as usual. So if we're talking about a linear life cycle, it's normally towards the end of the project, and it's the process of managing that handover of the project's outputs, making sure that they are accepted by the sponsor, they're accepted by business as usual, that operational environment. And normally it will culminate in the formal closure of the project. That's what transition and transition management is all about.
Good. Okay. So it sounds like at some point the organization it's going to need to be ready to take those outputs. So it's interesting because the first learning outcome says we need to know the basic requirements to support the successful transition. And some of the things it says we need to consider is business usual and planning for that transition. So in your view, what do you think are the really key considerations to ensure that a smooth transition?
I think that's really important because often the project and the project manager, they're so focused on that production of the outputs and the products of the project that they almost forget that that's not the end. It's almost the start of the life of these products. And actually, the place where value benefit is going to be delivered to the organisation that's invested in this project is only after those products, those outputs, have had some time and operation in business as usual. So achieving that smooth transition is so important, not only for us to be able to successfully close and deliver our project, but also for us to be able to get into that benefit realization stage as quickly as we possibly can. So what are some of the things that I'd say about how do we achieve that smooth transition? For me, it comes first and foremost down to people. It's so important to identify end users, people that are going to be taking these outputs now and putting them into use. We've got to engage with those key stakeholders, but also to manage their expectations as well. They've probably got a mixture of feelings about what's coming. They might be a little bit nervous. They might be a little bit suspicious of this new output, this new product service that's being delivered from our project. They might be excited to use it. They might have been waiting for this. I could imagine that on different projects that you've worked on, Carmen, people have got all sorts of different opinions about what's being produced and how that is going to deliver benefits to the organisation.
That's right. You're going to get a lot of feelings. For some people, they may make their job much easier. Other people may not be really happy about that change because they may have been doing something else for many, many years. So it's going to be quite difficult to get that person to buy in. And if you don't use it, then there is no value. So the project could have delivered something great that no one uses.
It's so important. Making sure that our key stakeholders, our end users, are familiarised with the deliverables of the project and really getting them involved early on so that we're not just chucking something over a wall at the end of the project and expecting there to be lots of excited people ready to catch this. We've really got to communicate clearly about what the transition process is going to be, what the impacts are going to be, so that we get that smooth transition.
That sounds really important. Are there any specific activities that perhaps could help us in that process of getting business as usual ready for that change?
There's a key technique that the project team can carry out called a change impact analysis. What's really important is that we've got a good understanding of what is actually going to be impacted. This might be physical impacts, process impacts. It could be the way that people feel about the change, knowledge, skills gaps that need to be addressed. So change impact analysis is a method that we can use to help us analyse and understand the scope and the scale of the change to our new business as usual state. And it's really going to help us build a picture of what those organisational impacts are, and then drive the planning, the communication that's required to achieve that smooth transition. So shall I run you through the change impact analysis process, and we can see how that might help?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Do we need to start thinking about this?
As early as we possibly can within the project lifecycle. A really good piece of advice is start with the end in mind. It's in the project's interest to make sure that what is delivered is transitioned as smoothly as possible. Not only does it help us achieve our success criteria for our project, but also it makes it more likely that what we've delivered is going to be successful, used, and then deliver benefits.
That is a really good insight.
The change impact analysis process has got 4 steps to it. The first one is to actually define what the change is. What's its purpose? What are its objectives? What's the scope of the change? What's the timeline of the change? We'll be doing that naturally as part of the early stages of our project. So let's just make sure that we're thinking about transition while we're doing that as well. The second step then is to identify the organisational areas, the business as usual areas that will be impacted by that change. So we need to consider a range of things. Most importantly, people. We need to think about performance of the new business as usual structure, the processes that might need to change, any other systems that might need to change, culture.
Yeah, that's right. And it's
Third
quite
step.
easy to forget about those logistics, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because you could deliver a new IT system, but you may need to think of a help desk, or you may
Yes.
deliver a new train, but have you thought about the maintenance, the storage?
I've got some good examples of just that. A new system is implemented, but people have forgotten to train the service desk, and so start getting some calls in, and the answer is sorry. What new payroll system?
Yeah.
There's lots of examples of when this isn't done well and how much impact it can have.
Yes, absolutely. So I think this is one of the steps that may be overlooked, and it's going to be quite important to scope everything.
So once you've scoped everything up, then you need to understand what that level of impact is going to be. There can be very differing impacts depending on what the change actually is.
Do you think that may impact the decision of considering whether that project should actually be an extended life cycle?
That's a really good question, yeah. Depending on what comes out of your change impact analysis, that's actually one of the considerations that you've got is if this is a really transformational change for an organisation, it may be better for us to consider this to be an extended life cycle. The last stage of change impact analysis is to develop this action plan that then addresses the impacts that we've identified. That should be something that we communicate regularly throughout the project, that we track our progress against, that needs to be maintained. I've seen some projects that have done a really good job of understanding the impacts of change in the early stages of projects. But what they haven't done is kept that aligned then with how the project is progressing. If you have changes that are made in the project environment that we take through a change control process, we need to also think about the impact of those changes on the overall change impact analysis.
That's true. That makes a lot of sense. I can really see how this practically may work, and I think it's quite important to consider that as one of the activities when planning for transition. Another thing we need to consider, which actually lead us quite nicely to the next criteria, is the knowledge transfer. So you could imagine, back to your example of the IT system, someone developing the code will know the system inside out.
Yeah.
So the criteria that we have is we need to understand the importance of that knowledge transfer as part of the transition process. Why is so important to ensure the knowledge is transferred successfully?
It's so easy to forget how much knowledge and working experience you've built up throughout the
That's
course of
right.
the project. Even the best documented project can't capture that learnt experience that each of the project team members has got. So we've really got to focus specifically on knowledge transfer to make sure that we can parcel up and hand over as much of that knowledge as we possibly can into business as usual.
That's right. Ultimately, they're gonna own it. So if they don't adopt it well, if they don't have the knowledge to use it, then there will be no
Abs-
value to them. So how can we
Absolutely.
do that? Could you talk us through the process of how we
Yeah.
can do that transfer of knowledge?
I think there's the hard side of knowledge transfer in terms of documentation and process
Hmm.
maps and all of those kind of things that we can hand over. But there's also the soft side as well, which is about encouraging learning, encouraging curiosity, making people feel open to receiving that new knowledge. Knowledge transfer is really helped the more you can get the end users, the people that will be looking after, supporting, maintaining whatever we've produced on our project in operation in business as usual. It's really helped if we can get them involved in our project in
Mm.
some capacity. Initially, when we start talking to our end users and our stakeholders about this, there is going to be very, very low level of knowledge. People are going to be wanting to know, what is this? How does this affect me? There's that great change curve that people go through, denial, anger,
Yes,
curiosity. And it's very similar to what happens with knowledge transfer. I
that's
think if you
true.
manage to answer those initial questions and really engage people, people are then open to a bit of experimentation. They think to themselves, oh, okay, yeah, this doesn't sound too bad. I'll give it a go. I'll try it. And again, if we make sure that we support that experimentation, that we communicate that people are trying this and what their feedback is, then people move into, yeah, okay, I'm using this more often. I'm practicing this. I'm
Yeah.
getting used to it. And then the next stage is to really make sure that we move into, this is now our embedded experience. You know when you've gone from experimentation and practice into, this is now embedded, because people stop saying, oh, the new system, the new process, the new building. It's just the system, the
Yeah.
process, the building.
Yeah.
It's how
It's
we
the
do
norm,
things.
isn't it? It's
It's
the
the norm.
norm.
Absolutely.
So I can see how important it is to support them through the journey because everything is difficult at the start. So if you
Yeah.
don't support them, you're going to start getting pushback and
Yeah.
denial, and they're not going to take that ownership on the new
Yeah.
product or the new system. So
Mm.
you mentioned a couple of things. So you mentioned the soft skills process, but you also mentioned
Yeah.
information that can support that learning journey. Do you have any specific examples of information that can be produced to support them?
Absolutely. Let's not forget the importance of all of the project documentation. That project documentation will tell the story of the project journey to the people that will be using this in operation. There are so many examples that I can think of when, let's say, an IT system, we've discovered some bugs during the project. How we've dealt with that, how we've developed workarounds, how we've then patched that. If we don't hand over that information to business as usual, something similar might come up. And those business as usual users have to start back down at ground zero, trying to
Yeah,
work all of that out themselves. If they have that project documentation, they can look through it and say, ah, look, something similar happened. This is how they dealt with it. Maybe we can deal with this in the same way. And it can get them to their answer a lot quicker. So the project documentation is really important. We mentioned
makes
in the
sense.
change impact analysis that processes may change. Let's make sure that we update process maps, standard operating procedures, all of those kind of things. And that's a great opportunity to do the soft knowledge transfer as well, because I'd really encourage our project to get the end users involved. That can help bridge that gap. We've got to think about all different things. What about supplier relationships? That again needs to be a gradual handover of that relationship.
That's right.
Well,
And I really like your point about involving them in the
yeah,
preparation. I could think of some examples of things like construction projects. So
Mm,
you need to have your drawings, you need to have your health
yeah,
and safety files, you need to have
absolutely.
your manuals, and you usually get the users to work with you
Yeah,
in the development and review of those manuals because they're going to be using it, so they will know
exactly.
better what information is going to be important.
It all goes towards that smooth transition. The end users are working with the project to update their business as usual environment, their documentation, their supporting procedures to be ready for our project deliverables. If the project does this in isolation and then just hands over a package with a red bow on it to the end users, what happens is the end users will just go through that and update that themselves from their own perspective. We're wasting time doing it twice when we could do it collaboratively together once.
Exactly. So we talk about the users getting involved. I assume
Yeah,
the project manager will own this. Anyone
absolutely.
else we need to get support from or
Yeah, our project sponsor plays a really critical role here. The project sponsor's role is about that vision and that focus on the vision, communicating that, getting stakeholders on board, particularly if this is a linear or an iterative life cycle. Once everything has been handed over, our project will come to an end. So the sponsor really is that person that is still there, that provides that continuity on into operation and benefits realization. Obviously, with an extended life cycle, our project manager will be around a little bit longer, which
Mhm.
again might be one of those considerations for whether or not we actually use an extended life cycle for transitions that are major changes.
So we talk about linear or possibly extended life cycle.
Yeah,
How is this knowledge transfer happen in a project that is agile, an iterative life cycle project? How does it
that's
work in these type of projects?
managing transition is quite different within an iterative life cycle. I think the structure of iterative or agile projects actually makes transition a little bit easier for a couple of reasons. The makeup of an agile project team should be much more collaborative, should have much greater input from the end users rather than being seen as a little bit external and as stakeholders. They really should be part and parcel of that project team. The fact that we are releasing outputs iteratively and incrementally as we go through an iterative life cycle, again, can help with that transition. Because although all of the same things apply, we've still got to consider what the impact of a new output is, who will be
Yeah.
impacted, processes, system. We still have to think about all of that. But the chunks of deliverable that we're releasing iteratively are going to be smaller, they're going to be more frequent. It's not quite such a huge transformation, such as may happen towards the end of a linear life cycle project.
Right. So it sounds like in terms of the process and the tools and the documentation, it's kind of similar. It sounds like a key difference is that iterative, probably that process will happen more often and the
Yeah,
information and the knowledge that is transferred, it's more gradually. Okay,
yes,
well,
yeah,
that's good. You gave us a really good idea of different tools, different considerations that we could take into account. But probably one of the most important things, which you mentioned at the start, is really to get the stakeholders engaged from the outset.
absolutely.
And this is one of the criteria that we have. Our learning outcome says we need to understand how to engage those stakeholders because we need to get them to agree to that transition plan. So, could you talk us through that in a little bit more detail? Give us some tips how we can get the stakeholders engaged.
Yeah, as you said there, this is probably the most important part of transition planning is engaging stakeholders. As the project team is stepping back and the business as usual team are stepping forward, there's a lot going on there. There's not just this change to get your head around. There's not just change processes, new systems, new buildings, whatever it may be to get used to. But there's also that transfer of responsibility and ownership, which
Mm.
can be a very difficult process to go through unless our stakeholders are well engaged and prepared. So we talked about the change impact analysis. That plus stakeholder mapping that we should be doing as part of our stakeholder engagement and communications. That will identify people who are impacted by the transition, interested in the project, and will have an interest in our deliverables. The key message here is do this early to make sure that there's that strategic alignment of both our project goals and the goals of business as usual, and make sure that this is a collaborative process.
That is really interesting because that links very nicely with our other podcast on stakeholder management and
Yes,
engagement. And
absolutely.
that analysis, considering not only the people that will be using the product, but anyone else affected by that change in the transition. You may not be using that new IT payroll system, but
Yeah.
you may be affected by that. For example, if
Yes.
you are in IT and there
Yeah.
is a support call. So it's quite interesting to see the link between stakeholder engagement and getting acceptance of that transition plan.
There should be as much an operational acceptance, a business readiness assessment, as much as the sponsor accepts the deliverables. There needs to be that agreement by wider stakeholders that, yeah, we are ready.
We used to have as well in the projects, sometimes coming to the reviews, a representative from every stakeholder group. So if your project will affect IT, maintenance, service and support, and then, as you said, by getting them engaged from the start, that really could help.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking back to a project that I worked on with NATS, the air traffic control system in the UK. Transition is very much about transfer of risk, transition of responsibility. One of the things that they maintain when there are updates to their air traffic control systems, there's not just sign off that's required by the sponsor, but sign off that's required by every single air traffic controller. Because if there's even just one air traffic controller that does not feel safe operating the new system, then it will not go into operation. And I think that's a really good example of making sure that there is absolutely that business as usual readiness, because I'm sure that none of us want to be going on our holidays where there's an air traffic controller that's not quite sure how this new system works. And those safeguards have to be in place because of that.
Yeah, and ultimately they're taking ownership on that. So
Yeah.
I fully agree. It's really important that they have that acceptance and they get involved in the decisions. So we talk a little bit about the differences between linear and iterative in terms of transferring that information and the learning process. Do you think there are any differences as well in the way or the frequency we get that stakeholder engagement between those two life cycles?
Yeah, one is the linear life cycle. There's a more gradual involvement. We should start very early on, but often because the design of the project, the design of the deliverables, a lot more of that is done and is known and is more certain up front. There's a more structured, gradual transition planning and involvement and collaboration with stakeholders. Whereas for me, within the iterative life cycle, those stakeholders are involved in that design process and that transition planning right from the beginning of the project. There are some differences between linear and iterative life cycles, but I think we've all got the same aim in mind.
Right, and both need to involve them continuously,
Absolutely.
even if it's more embedded or not. Fantastic. I think we covered everything. We talk about the key requirements to support the smooth transition of projects. We also talk about the importance of knowledge transfer and ensure people using the products delivered by the project are well equipped to do so. And we also talk about the importance of engaging stakeholders to get buy-in on the transition plan. That was really good.
It's a really nice holistic look at transition management. It's so important because often projects don't think about the end of the project sense. They think the end is, okay, great, we've delivered this now. The job's been done, and it hasn't.
I really like your quote. That's for me the key takeaway. Start with the end in mind. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was really insightful.
That's great. I've enjoyed talking about transition management. Thanks,
See
Carmen.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.